Hey guys, it's Chris Monk at Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. What I thought I would talk about in this episode is I like to address a couple of questions which have been posed by buyers of my guitars. And the questions have to do with the necks that I make. And one of the questions came from a buyer who wanted to know why I use a scarf joint on my necks. And then another buyer wanted to know about why I use a volute and where it's positioned on the neck and why. Pretty good questions and simple to answer, I think. First of all, the scarf joint. I use a scarf joint because all my necks feature an angled headstock. Now, traditionally, in the past, angled headstock necks were made by taking a very large, thick piece of wood and carving away all the wood until you had a neck with an angled headstock. It was all one piece. Well, the problem with that is the headstock tends to have what's known as short grain. In other words, while the grain is running straight through the neck and parallel to the fretboard, its entire length, once it gets to the headstock, if it's all one piece of wood, that grain is shorter. It just runs through that angled portion of the headstock. I hope that makes sense. I'll try and include a diagram to kind of explain that a little bit better. But what that means is the headstock is not going to be as strong as the rest of the neck because of that short grain. And that's a major issue when you're using a wood such as mahogany. You've probably seen headstocks, the mahogany headstocks where it has snapped off somewhere along its length, and that's because of the short grain. So what a lot of guitar builders like to do is use a scarf joint in order to eliminate the short grain and make it the grain so that it runs the entire length of the headstock, and that makes for a much stronger headstock. And that's important, especially with a guitar neck under string tension, because as you know, it's always possible that if you bump a guitar and knock it over, if that neck hits the floor, it's going to snap. The headstock, at least. So I use a scarf joint. Now, there's different ways that you can do a scarf joint. And a lot of guys will do a scarf joint which appears on the headstock. And what they'll do is they'll use a cap like this to cover up that joint so you can't see it. But if you turn it around, sometimes you can see that joint running through the neck. I do mine further back on the neck, and that gives me a much larger glue surface and results in a much stronger joint. And if you know anything about wood glue, you'll know that when you glue two pieces of wood together with wood glue and clamp them properly, you can actually end up with an area that's stronger than the rest of the wood. So it is much stronger where this scarf joint has been made. Now, it does mean you'll see a line, that kind of arched line, and some people may find that bothersome. I think most people don't. It certainly doesn't bother me, and you can actually dress it up with different colors of wood and do some pretty creative things with it. So, but typically, I will start out with a blank that looks something like this. This is a piece of quarter sawn Eastern Rock maple, very strong, very hard wood. And then what I'll do is I'll measure out the angle, and it's typically drawn along the edge on the side. And then I'll take it over to my bandsaw and I'll cut it so that it kind of comes apart like this. This is actually some flamed maple that I'm going to be using on some guitar necks. But then once this piece is cut away, I can then flip it over and I'll glue it back down, and that's how I get my angle. Now another question that people have asked is, what is the right angle to use? Well, there really is no right angle to use. I've seen people go as far as 17 degrees. 14 is fairly common. I like to use 10 degrees because I think it looks better. I don't like steeply angled necks. It looks almost like a mistake to me. I like a shallower angle, and I found in my testing, it really makes no difference. People will tell you the sharper the angle or the steeper the angle, the more string tension you're going to have, and that's better. But the reality is, let's see. I'll see if I can make this make sense. If you tune a guitar to E, A, D, G, B, E, like most people do, if you were to magically find a way to adjust the angle of that headstock and increase it to a steeper angle, you're going to pull the strings out of tune. So then you have to detune them to bring them back into tune. That reduces the string tension. So in truth, the string tension on a 10-degree angled headstock is really no different than the string tension on a 17-degree angled headstock. There isn't enough of a difference there to even be able to measure it. So there's no point in going with such a sharply angled headstock. So I keep mine at around 10 degrees, which, as I said, I think looks a lot better. Whew. Okay, so after I glued it together, this is kind of what I wind up with. And this is what I will machine into the final shape of my guitar neck. Now, the volute. What is the volute there for, and how is it positioned? I've had people ask why I'm positioning the scarf joint where it is. They think it should be where the volute is, and that's not true. The two aren't related. The volute is positioned at the thinnest and potentially weakest part of the neck. So instead of it being this thin, it's now a little bit thicker, and that increases the strength. It isn't absolutely necessary to have a volute on a maple neck, especially if it's an Eastern Rock maple neck, which is so incredibly hard and strong. But it does add a little bit of insurance. So I place it at the thinnest part of the neck, right where the nut is. And I try to position it so that the volute is right at the front edge of the tuner side of the nut. I don't want to position it any further back because it interferes with playability. So I move the volute right there to the, so that it's right under where the nut will be. And it's also where the deepest part of the truss rod slot is. And that means if I didn't have a volute, that area of wood back there would be incredibly thin and potentially at risk for cracking if the guitar were to be, if the headstock were to be banged against something. So that's why I position the volute. And as you can see, the volute I have on my necks is not that extreme. It doesn't have to be. It's only about maybe 1/4 of an inch higher than the rest of the neck. Some of them I've seen can be really outrageous, and that's okay as long as it's not going to interfere with the playability of the neck. But I keep mine as low as possible and positioned where it is to so that it serves a purpose of increasing the strength of the neck right where the headstock starts to angle down. And in the end, I think I end up with a very strong neck, and I'm not that concerned with it ever having to break. So that's basically the reason why I use a scarf joint and the reasoning behind the size and placement of my volute. So I hope that makes sense. And that's really all I have for this episode. Take care, and we'll see you in the next episode from the Luthier's Workbench.